And Jonathan Swift wrote this fantasy as a mechanism to poke fun at or to satirize the situation in London at the time. And he wrote his stories about the Gulliver's Travels, in which Gulliver encounters a number of these strange places, and in Swift's dealing with this, he uses it to poke at the problems in those days. But the point is that in one of these, in his third voyage, Gulliver encounters a place called Laputa. Not Lilliput, that's the little people, that's the first voyage that most people are familiar with. But unless you've been through Gulliver's Travels, the whole thing, there are some other voyages. Anyway, in Laputa, the astronomers in Laputa brag that they know about the 2 moons of Mars, and the astronomers in London don't. Now, to give you a little background here, Galileo did his things with a telescope in about 1610. And then Herschel in subsequent years discovered a number of the planets and made astronomical history over in the later 1700s. It wasn't until 1877, not the 1700s, 1877, that Asaph Hall, using a brand new telescope at the time in the United States Naval Observatory, shocked the astronomical world by discovering that Mars had 2 moons. Some of the other moons had been well discovered by then, but everybody knew in those days that Mars was noticeably absent any moons, except Asaph Hall in the new telescope discovered it had 2 moons. Now, the reason they're so hard to find is they're very small, like 8 miles across. That's pretty small. And they're almost black. They have a reflectivity of less than 3%. But with this telescope and the improved optics and all of that, he discovered the 2 moons of Mars, made astronomical history by announcing this. Now, what's rather provocative is that, incidentally, one of these rotates around Mars slightly slower than the surface speed, which means it appears to go slightly backwards, the only object in our solar system that does that. In Jonathan Swift's description of all of this, he describes their orbits and all that with a surprising degree of accuracy. It's not precise, it's off 10-20%. But still, that's startling, including the retrograde motion. So the point is, what does this got to do with anything? Well, it turns out that Asaph Hall discovered the 2 moons of Mars in 1877. Jonathan Swift published Gulliver's Travels in 1726, 151 years earlier. And the problem is that the only way you could see the 2 moons of Mars would be if Mars passed close enough that you could see it with as an eyewitness. And so the big conjecture among scholars is, how did Jonathan Swift put that in Gulliver's Travels? One of the theories advanced by one writer is it was a lucky guess, which I think most of us would dismiss as not too plausible. Did Jonathan Swift really know about 2 moons of Mars? Probably not. But the conjecture, and there's some reason to believe that he had access to some Chinese drawings. He apparently had access to ideas that he probably thought were just legends, but he drew upon those to embroider his fantasy, his satire, not realizing that those sketches and notes that he apparently had access to were actually notes from an eyewitness account of one of the near pass-bys of Mars, where Mars would have been maybe 80,000 miles from the Earth on the pass-by. And so those are all conjectures, but the point is, this may explain why on these near pass-bys of Mars, it would always pass by either about October 25th or March 22nd. And it's interesting that the Celtic New Year was at the end of that month. And it's interesting that the worship of the planet Mars seems to be associated with many of these practices. The Romans had their New Year in March, and some of the near pass-bys would be in March. It would depend on some things I won't bother getting into here. The January 1st New Year, we are recognized. Rome in about 364 BC changed it to January, and the European nations at various times in the 16th, 17th century changed it to January. So the January 1st New Year, as we know it, was a later arrangement. But as we watch this then, as we look at all this, we begin to understand our biblical expressions where it speaks of them worshiping the hosts of heaven, which are, of course, are detailed, are mentioned in the Bible as a form of idol worship, a form of demon worship, and the rest of it. And yet, we may wonder where that all starts. It was because there apparently were some reasons for them to be very concerned about Baal or Mars, and that October 31st year-end tradition seems to be tied to that. Getting back to our celebrating Halloween. Obviously, there are a lot of superstitions that surround it. There are many people in many parts of the world that still today believe that particular rituals can have real supernatural effects. There are all kinds of superstitions surrounding this holiday, and these go beyond cataloging. But just a few of them. In New Orleans, the Voodoo Museum offers a special Halloween ritual in which people may see true voodoo rites. In Salem, Massachusetts, a Halloween festival occurs from October 13th to the 31st and also includes a psychic fair. As you start going on and on about this, there are many, many Christians that get really concerned. And I can't resist sharing with you one incident occurred at Pat Matriciana. He's the head of Jeremiah Films and did these very, very well done videos on various pagan customs and so forth. Pat was on a talk show, and he was getting set up. It happened that he had access to a earpiece that was connected to the instructions. And due to some unknown crosstalk between the channels, he could, by having it turned up way high, he heard the director tell one of the other people, "Let's set this wacko up." This was during a station break kind of thing. So Pat knew he was being set up. And he thought, the only way to do this is take, Pat, typically, if you know Pat Matriciana, the thing to do is take the offense. So when they came back live, he threw out this one-liner. For a Christian to celebrate Halloween is like asking a Holocaust survivor to celebrate Hitler's birthday. Well, he was on his way, you know. But it's an interesting problem because we, as Christians, should have some real problems with all of this on the one hand, and the other hand, it's a difficult thing as to where do you really draw the line. What do you really do to not, on the one hand, appear like some kind of wacko, on the other hand, deal with this thing very directly. Now let's go on a little bit further and talk about some of the dangers. You see, Halloween can be what you might call a crossover involvement, in which innocent games can lead to serious entanglement with real witches, neo-pagans, New Agers, and other occultists. Now, one of the things that tends to show up around Halloween especially are Ouija boards. Now, how many have seen one or know what I'm talking about, the Ouija board? Okay, so it's a common thing. Most of you are aware of it. You can probably find them in any department store. It was actually invented by a guy just as a business item. The name comes from the word yes in two languages, oui in French and ja in German. And from that was contrived the label, for lack of something else, of Ouija for this little amusement. And of course, it is there's nothing intrinsically wrong with a piece of plywood with some letters on it and a little pointer, and yet used the way it's used can be what's called an entry. And sometimes these things are used as just practical jokes. Sometimes these things are used as serious forms of inquiry. How many of you have read the book or seen the movie called The Exorcist? Okay, we can use that as a form of communication. William Blatty wrote the story that they made the movie from. Now, what I remember at the time, I was with Walter Martin on his board, and Walter Martin set out, he was very offended by the movie, and he set out to discredit William Blatty. But as he did his research, he was startled to discover that William Blatty had done his homework. That novel, although Walter was always upset with the way he happened to choose to arrange the fiction, it was based on a true case study. Actually, it's an amalgam of several, but it was primarily based not on a girl, but on a boy in New Jersey. And so it was, but the reason I bring this up is if you may recall, much of that movie did chronicle aspects of several of these case studies that William Blatty used as background. But the reason I bring it up is because what started this tragic girl down that path was her fooling around with a Ouija board. And these things are dangerous. Now, it turns out, by the way, that this game, the patents, copyrights of the Ouija board, is a intellectual property that has been purchased by a company called Parker Brothers. How many know the company Parker Brothers?